Welcome back to another video on Form 5 Biology. In this video, we'll be studying the role of the circulatory system in the body's defense mechanism, and we'll talk about types of immunity. So this lesson will be divided into two parts, two videos. The first video here, will talk about active immunity, and the second one will talk about passive immunity. For this first video on active immunity, here are the learning outcomes. Firstly, state the definition of immunity and immunization. Secondly, explain how the following types of immunity are acquired and make a comparison. Active immunity and natural active immunity compared to artificial active immunity. Thirdly, state examples of diseases related to the different types of immunity. And fourthly, explain the graphs related to the different types of immunity. So what is immunity? Immunity is the ability of an organism to resist infection. Infection means the invasion of the body by pathogens or disease-causing microorganisms that are found everywhere in the surroundings. And immunity is the ability to defend oneself against infection by pathogens. So as I said before, we are in a war with the pathogens or the microorganisms around us. And they try to get into the human body and reproduce there. They're actually parasites. And our body has to defend itself and build up immunity against the pathogens in order to destroy them as they enter the body. So immunity depends on the presence of lymphocytes, which produce specific antibodies during infection, and this is called a specific immune response. So here we see the lymphocytes. This is an example of a lymphocyte, a special white blood cell that can produce antibodies, which are chemical substances that can destroy pathogens. So when pathogens try to enter our body, the lymphocytes are stimulated to produce the antibodies. So see, the word antibodies means anti the bodies of the pathogens. And the antibodies will try to destroy the pathogens so that they cannot infect our body and cause disease. So a person with a strong immune system is one who is able to destroy pathogens that enter the body very quickly, and as a result, he will not fall sick. What are the different types of immunity? There are basically two types of immunity. A, active immunity, and B, passive immunity. Now, active immunity is divided into two types: natural active immunity and artificial active immunity. The meaning of the word active immunity is that it is a type of immunity that is acquired when the body, the lymphocytes in the body, produces its own antibodies as it is stimulated by antigens. For example, pathogens that have entered the blood and the body. So pathogens such as viruses and bacteria that have entered the body and the blood will stimulate lymphocytes in the body to come to the defense of the body. So the lymphocytes will produce the chemical substances made of proteins, which are called antibodies. So these antibodies will bind to the pathogens, and through the many modes of action, they will destroy the pathogens. For example, they can destroy the pathogens through lysis or precipitation, and so forth. So this is how the body gets active immunity. So the word active here means that the body or the lymphocytes actively produces its own antibodies as it is stimulated by the antigens or pathogens. Okay, just briefly, active immunity can be divided into natural and artificial active immunity. So what is natural active immunity? It occurs when a person falls sick and recovers from a disease. And artificial active immunity is acquired through injection of vaccines, which are dead or weakened pathogens that are injected into the body to stimulate the lymphocytes to produce antibodies. We will come to that later. Just remember first that in active immunity, the body's lymphocytes actively produce their own antibodies against the pathogens or antigens. The second type of immunity is called passive immunity, which is divided into natural passive immunity and artificial passive immunity. In passive immunity, the body receives antibodies from external sources, for example, from mother or from an animal's blood. So in this case, the body was passive in that it did not produce its own antibodies. The lymphocytes in the body did not produce the antibodies against that specific pathogen. The body was given the antibodies from external sources. For example, from mother to the baby through the mother's milk, or from mother to fetus through the placenta. And for the second type of passive immunity, which is artificial passive immunity, there is injection of anti-serum. We'll discuss that later. Here is a good schematic diagram to help us have an overview of the different types of immunity. So basically, immunity is divided into two types, which is active immunity and passive immunity. Active immunity, as we have discussed before, occurs when a person's own body produces his own antibodies when stimulated by antigens. And these antibodies are produced in high concentrations to destroy a specific antigen that has entered the body so that it will not cause disease. So a person's body actively produces his own antibodies, or his lymphocytes actively produce their own antibodies. For passive immunity, the body receives the antibodies from an external source, for example, from mother or from injection. Now, active immunity can be divided into natural active immunity and artificial active immunity. In natural active immunity, a person naturally falls sick when infected and starts to produce his own antibodies against that antigen or pathogen, and then he recovers. So when he recovers, he's already got a high concentration of these antibodies that can help him to defend his body against a second infection by the same pathogens. And he also has memory cells, as we'll discuss later, that are able to help produce the specific antibody against the same pathogen which made him fall sick. So during the second infection, he will not fall sick anymore. He'll be able to destroy the same pathogens that made him fall sick at the start. And that's how he got natural active immunity. Fall sick, recover, and then he gets the immunity. In artificial active immunity, a vaccine, which is made up of dead or weakened antigens or pathogens, is injected into the body to stimulate the body to produce its own antibodies. So the person does not fall sick. He just receives an injection, and then his lymphocytes are able to produce the specific antibodies against the pathogens, so that the next time, in case the pathogens infect the body, the lymphocytes are ready to produce the same antibodies to destroy all the pathogens. We'll discuss these two types later. Now, for passive immunity is divided into two types too, and that is natural passive immunity and artificial passive immunity. In natural passive immunity, the baby or fetus receives the antibodies from the mother through the mother's milk, or if it's for a pregnant lady, then the fetus will receive the antibodies from the mother through the placenta, which is an organ that supplies the baby with food, oxygen, and also the antibodies. In artificial passive immunity, again an injection is required. An anti-serum is injected into the body, and this anti-serum contains ready-made antibodies, which when injected into the body will help the person to acquire artificial passive immunity and will destroy the pathogens that have entered the body. The first type of immunity is called naturally acquired active immunity. It is acquired after a person falls sick and then recovers from an infection such as measles, chickenpox, and mumps, or even influenza. So when a person falls sick from an infectious disease due to pathogens or disease-causing microorganisms, when he falls sick, his lymphocytes will start to produce specific antibodies against the pathogens of the disease. And these specific antibodies will increase gradually in his body until they reach the level of immunity. So the level of immunity is a concentration of the antibodies that is high and must be reached in order for the body to destroy all the pathogens. So if a person has antibodies but at a low level, he may not be able to recover. He must achieve a certain level of antibodies called the level of immunity so that he is able to destroy all the pathogens in his body. So when his level of antibodies has reached or gone above the level of immunity, his body is able to destroy all the pathogens and thus he recovers from the infection. But in the meantime, as his lymphocytes start to produce these antibodies before reaching the level of immunity, he may fall sick and show the symptoms of the disease. Okay, right, so after he recovers, he has a high level of the antibodies, specific antibodies for that disease. But that level of antibody may decrease slowly. Anyhow, if there's a second infection in the future, there are memory cells already produced. Memory cells are long-living lymphocytes that can produce more of the same type of antibodies in the future. It's like they remember how to produce that type of antibody, specific antibody. Okay, but we don't say that they remember, we say that they can produce more of the same antibodies. So that's why they are called memory cells. And these cells are very important because they will help the person to produce the antibodies in greater amounts and more rapidly to destroy the same pathogen that tries to infect the body. Okay, or the same antigen. Antigen here means the pathogen that has entered the blood and the body. Okay, so the memory cells help us so that, or help the person who has fallen sick before from the disease. So the second time round, he will not fall sick again because his memory cells have helped to in the production of high level of antibodies very quickly to destroy all the pathogens so that he doesn't fall sick. And he is immune to the disease. We say he's immune to the disease. Okay, so that is naturally acquired active immunity is natural because it is a natural process. Person falls sick and recovers, and there was no injection given in this case. Active means that his own body, his own lymphocytes produced the antibodies. Let's look at the graph for naturally acquired active immunity. Naturally here means that the person naturally fell sick and recovered. He was not given any injection of vaccine or anti-serum. And active means the person's own lymphocytes produce the antibodies. to destroy the pathogens. The antibodies did not come from an external source. Okay, so this graph shows the concentration of antibodies against time. Let's look at the white curve here. This is the first infection. So at point 0, the pathogens entered the body, and this caused the lymphocytes. It stimulated the lymphocytes in the body of the person to produce antibodies, specific antibodies to destroy the pathogens. Take, for example, the pathogens of chickenpox, which is the virus for chickenpox. So once the virus goes into the body, then the lymphocytes start producing the specific antibodies against the chickenpox virus. So the level of antibodies will increase until it reaches the level of immunity. And this level of immunity is a concentration of antibodies that must be reached in order to attain immunity. So it's a high level of antibodies in order to wipe out or to destroy all the pathogens. Okay, so if he has the antibodies at a low level, he may not be able to destroy all the pathogens yet. He has to increase it until it reaches quite a high level. Then he's immune and he will recover because his body can destroy all the pathogens. But before reaching the level of immunity, from this point until this point here in the graph, the lower part, he will fall sick. He'll fall sick and show the symptoms of the disease. Like for chickenpox, there may be fever and the pox may form on the skin. Right, so after that, his level of antibody is very high, above the level of immunity, and he recovers from the disease. The pathogens are all destroyed. Okay, so there'll be a high level of antibodies for some time, but it can also decrease with time, below the level of immunity. What happens in the second infection? Let's say a few years later or a few months later, he gets infected with the chickenpox virus again. Now, the second time round, in the second infection, he already has these memory cells, which are lymphocytes, that can produce the same type of antibodies against chickenpox virus. So these memory cells will cause a more rapid immune response. So more antibodies will be produced and more quickly too. So the graph here is steeper than the white graph. And more antibodies will be produced. So the peak here is higher than this one here. So the antibodies will reach the level of immunity. The concentration of antibodies will reach the level of immunity faster also. So he may not fall sick because he can destroy the pathogens very fast and he will not fall sick. Instead, we say that he is immune against the disease already because his lymphocytes can produce the antibodies very quickly and at a high level to destroy all the pathogens. Okay, so the graph of first infection shows that the production of antibodies is lower. But for the second infection, the production is faster and at a higher level. So this is how the person acquires naturally acquired active immunity. The second type of active immunity is called artificial active immunity. So this type of immunity is achieved through vaccination or immunization. Vaccination means injection of vaccine into a healthy person, whereas immunization is the process of making a person immune or resistant to an infectious disease. Usually this is done by vaccination or injection of vaccine. So what is a vaccine? A vaccine is a suspension that contains dead or killed or weakened antigens and pathogens. So they are weakened or dead so that they will not harm us. But they will, when injected, stimulate the lymphocytes in the human body to produce the specific antibodies against that antigen. So it is to help the human body produce the specific antibodies against the antigen and to have memory cells for that specific pathogen. So these memory cells are lymphocytes that are produced after vaccination, and they are able to stimulate production of large amounts of antibodies, that same antibody, when attacked by the same antigen in the future. So notice that in vaccination, the person did not fall sick naturally. He was just given an injection that contained the weakened or dead antigens or pathogens to help his lymphocytes produce that specific antibody and to help the body have some memory cells, which are long-living lymphocytes that already can produce that specific antibody. So that in future, if he ever was infected with the same antigen or pathogen, then he will be able to produce that specific antibody to destroy all the antigens that have entered his body. Okay? So this is the graph for artificially acquired active immunity. The concentration of antibodies is plotted against time. For the first injection of vaccine, at the 0 point, when the vaccine is injected into the body, the weakened or dead pathogens will stimulate the lymphocytes to produce antibodies, specific antibodies against the pathogens. Thus, the concentration of antibodies will rise gradually as the lymphocytes produce more and more antibodies. However, if the stimulation is not strong enough, the antibody level will reach until here only and won't reach the level of immunity. Then it will drop down again. Thus, a second injection of vaccine called the booster dose may be needed to further stimulate the lymphocytes to produce more antibodies until the level of antibodies or concentration of antibodies exceeds the level of immunity. In this way, the person will become immune at this point here when the concentration of antibodies exceed the level of immunity. So this level of immunity is a certain concentration of antibodies that must be achieved in order to become immune, so that all the pathogens can be destroyed by the body. Thus, we see here the reading. For first injection, the antibody level is below the level of immunity. Thus, a second injection of vaccine is needed, called the booster dose, to further increase the concentration of the antibodies so that it exceeds the level of immunity and the person will become immune for a long period of time usually. So when the second injection is given, it stimulates quicker and greater production of antibodies. This curve here is steeper, the gradient is steeper than the first one. So it shows that the production of antibodies is faster. And also the peak is higher, meaning that there's greater production of antibodies. So the shape of the graph for injection of vaccine is like two peaks of two mountains. First one may be lower and the second one is higher. This is for artificially acquired active immunity. Let us discuss some examples of vaccines that have been developed to help us build our immunity and protect us from various infectious diseases. The first vaccine was developed by Dr. Edward Jenner in 1796. So from then on, many vaccines have been developed, and today there are these different types of vaccines and more that are very useful to us. So BCG vaccine is for tuberculosis, which is a dangerous lung disease. So BCG vaccine is given to newborn babies soon after birth to help protect them from this dangerous disease, tuberculosis, that is transmitted easily by air. Second vaccine is called the Salk vaccine, invented by Dr. Edward Salk for poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis is a dangerous disease that attacks the nerves and can cause paralysis. The third vaccine is for hepatitis B, which is a liver disease. And the fourth vaccine is rubella vaccine for women. So why do women need to get the rubella vaccine? Actually, the rubella sickness or disease is a mild disease that causes fever and also rashes. But if a pregnant woman were to get rubella or suffer from this disease, the rubella virus can attack the young tissues of the fetus and cause many problems in the fetus like heart defects. And this is why women should be protected from the rubella virus by getting the rubella vaccine so that they can have immunity against the rubella virus. Let us discuss a common exam question. Why is a second dose or booster dose of vaccine sometimes needed in the process of immunization? Referring to the graph here, we can see that 2 injections were given. In the first injection here, when the antigens were introduced, the lymphocytes were stimulated and started to produce the antibodies, the specific antibodies for the antigens. However, after some time, before reaching the level of immunity, the level of antibodies starts to drop. So a second injection of vaccine is needed to further stimulate the lymphocytes. The second time the lymphocytes are exposed to the same antigen, they will start to produce the antibodies at a higher rate and also in greater amounts. And this causes the concentration of antibodies to exceed the level of immunity here. Thus, in this way, the person becomes immune to the disease because his high concentration of antibodies will help the body to destroy all the pathogens or antigens of the same type as found in the vaccine, in case there is an infection in the future. So the second dose or booster dose is needed to increase the concentration of antibodies so that it exceeds the level of immunity and the person will become immune to the disease and he can resist future infections. Thus, he acquires artificial active immunity. That's all for this video. Do try the question that I've uploaded. It's a video on how to answer essay questions. And the question is based on types of immunity. Do try that question because it is a popular question for the exam and it has not been asked so often these past few years. In the next lesson, we'll continue to discuss Chapter 1, Part 2 about transport in plants, especially about the xylem and phloem tissue and other topics related to it like transpiration and opening and closing of the stomata. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next video. Share, like and subscribe. Thank you.